Guilt was weaponized. Dan Major joins us from the Vance Johnson Recovery Center. He talks about his recovery, his various books, including Some Assembly Required, A Balanced Approach to Recovery from Addiction and Chronic Pain, Breathing and Mindfulness, and the messaging we use with ourselves. Enjoy. Welcome to the Illuminate Recovery Podcast. We shed light on mental health issues, mental illness, and addiction recovery. Ways to cope, manage, and inspire. Beyond the self-care we will discuss, you may need the help of a licensed professional. My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery Podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
Today, Dan Major is joining us. I'm super excited to have Dan. Dan is the author of Some Assembly Required, A Balanced Approach to Recovery from Addiction and Chronic Pain. He's also the author of Roots to Wins, Mindful Parenting and Recovery. He writes for Psychology Today, does a blog on Psychology Today, and he has a master's degree in social work. He has a lot of other specialties and things that he brings to the table. And Dan, super excited for you to come on today and share with us.
Thank you so much, Shelley. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's maybe start out by maybe sharing with our listeners some of your background. How did you end up in the recovery industry? And these books, these titles to your books are pretty profound. Like, these are intense. When you couple addiction with pain and trying to manage that for people who have chronic pain, that's a serious thing. That's pretty challenging, and I think we're still learning a lot about how to do that. So I'd love to kind of hear your history of how you ended up kind of where you're at right now.
Well, it's been a fascinating, circuitous adventure, Shelley, in that, the social sciences were always where my head and heart were. And I learned how to meditate when I was 16. That was over 45 years ago. And that was a really fortuitous turn of fate when my mother strongly suggested it to an impressively rebellious oppositional teenager, and knowing that it could be helpful for me. And although my initial inclination was to say no, absolutely not, I figured, let me give her, for once, something to not push back against. And then when it didn't work, I could say, see, I told you so, but I wouldn't be blamed for having dismissed it out of hand. So I learned a particular form of meditation and actually gravitated to it in a way that surprised me. And so I've been meditating. There were a handful of years where I didn't do it regularly, but basically I've had a daily meditation practice for over 40 years now. I'm going to jump around a little bit. And so my daily meditation practice and interest in the connection between the mind and the body and the mind and the heart led me to increasingly be interested in other mindfulness practices, and mindfulness as a general way of shifting the activity of our central nervous systems to effectively deactivate the sympathetic division of our autonomic nervous system, basic and shift away from the stress or threat response, which happens with disturbing consistency among the vast majority of people. We're caught up in various, often low-level states of stress, anxiety, fear, and so forth, often that we're not even conscious of. And mindfulness and meditation as a primary mindfulness practice help us to literally change the activity in our nervous system, activating the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system and engaging the part of our body that's active during relaxation and calming. And that in and of itself is a significant mental and emotional as well as physical health intervention. So, so how does this relate to my interest in addiction and moving into that area in terms of professional endeavors? Well, I mean, basically, even though I had been pretty successful in school and in sports in high school, graduated college with honors, and moved into what was a very successful behavioral health career. The bottom line is that I had been using substances, all manner of substances, although I had different phases and different preferences at different times, consistently since I was about 16. I started when I was 11 or 12 and used one thing or another, often more than one thing, almost every day from the time that I was 16 until 47, when I got to the point that I could no longer walk this tightrope of functionality, keeping my active addiction in check enough where I could, maintain my job and career, what had been a successful marriage, relationships with two at that time teenage daughters, and it got to the point that I effectively fell off that tightrope, as everyone does inevitably when they use alcohol and other mind and mood altering drugs for long enough. The ability to balance oneself and live that double life always has an expiration date, and I dragged mine out for as long as I possibly could until I had done enough damage to my marriage, my career, that I really had very few options but to consider going into treatment myself, spending some quality time on the other side of the desk, and doing what was required to pull my head out of the cozy but nonetheless comfortable confines of my butt, and be willing to take the incredibly uncomfortable but ultimately very healthy risk of changing my life dramatically and entering recovery. And at this point, I've been in recovery since the beginning of November 2006. So well over 14 years at this point. And so my professional work, both of the books and my Psychology Today blog, as well as whatever teaching and trainings that I facilitate, is very much informed by this combination of personal experience and professional education, training, and experience. And in terms of addiction and chronic pain as co-occurring disorders, that's also an important part of my story, because I was going along quite smoothly, working a rigorous program at that time of alcohol and marijuana maintenance. Looking back on it retrospectively, even though even though it didn't affect my career and didn't have many effects on other aspects of my life, although obviously I couldn't be as emotionally available or as present-centered as I would have been. But this was a smooth, kind of gentle phase of my active addiction. And then in 1998, I was diagnosed with a chronic pain condition, two herniated discs in my lumbar spine, and I was offered prescriptions for very powerful opioids. And this was shortly after prescribing practices had been changed dramatically, such that people with, who weren't coming out of surgery or had acute injuries where it was very short term or had non-cancer pain were being prescribed all manner of opioids. So in terms of the opioid epidemic, I was at the cutting edge of that. And even though part of me knew that it was a terrible idea to begin to take these medications, another part of me figured, well, this is spectacular. I get to use what has always ultimately been my particular substance of choice, albeit in a different form, and yet it's perfectly legal and completely medically sanctioned. And I think I was able to take the medication as it was prescribed, perhaps for 2 months, and then it was running a race I was always behind in, running out on a monthly basis, self-detoxing effectively in a way that was increasingly horrific related to the withdrawals. It was really my own form of torturous, perverse menstrual cycle. And it took 8 years in order for me to get to the place where, again, I had done enough harm to myself and those closest to me that I needed to do something dramatically different. And I went to treatment in a place where, at the time, it was only one of 3 places in the United States that did treatment for co-occurring addiction and chronic pain. And the medical director there is one of the foremost experts in the country, if not the world, Dr. Mel Cole, who's written widely and taught all over the world about recovery from co-occurring addiction and chronic pain. And so that became my initial model that I've since expanded and built upon. And I was able to do quite a bit of work. We did some mutual projects together, Dr. Pohl and I, and he was generous enough to write the foreword for my first book, Some Assembly Required, and gave a lovely endorsement for the second book, Roots and Wings. So the writing that I do is really the sum total of all of these different experiences where, as we talked about in the preamble, I have to believe that the universe has gifted me with these particular experiences, including the desperation, as we say in my 12-step program, necessary to make the profound, deeply difficult and uncomfortable changes that help me transition from active addiction into recovery, in order to be able to be of service and teach what I know, help others to understand this material and apply it to the best of all of our abilities.
Wow, quite the. I mean, I love your clinical background, because it really helps to put some more technical information in place to help people understand what's going on in the body and the brain. So I love that background and that perspective. I caught a few things as you were sharing your story, and one of them is, I've rarely heard anyone say, hey, when I was 16, my mom suggested I do meditation. I don't hear that very often in the recovery industry. So give me a little bit of background on your parents and maybe your family life when you were younger that would bring your mother to suggest that.
Well, God bless my mother who passed during the pandemic in April of not this past year, but 2020. But both my parents were brilliant, progressive individuals. Um, my father grew up uh, incredibly poor during the Depression and became the epitome of a very successful self-made person. And all and the expectations were incredibly demanding. And he was a very hard personality. There was little physical abuse to speak of, but there was a ton of verbal and emotional abuse that went along with that. So I developed a wide range of defenses and self-protective mechanisms to go along with that. Using Claudia Black's and Sharon Wexheider Cruz's paradigm related to family roles. Even though I was the oldest of four kids born within 6 years, I was absolutely the scapegoat, and played that role really well. And it's one of the fortuitous aspects of my life experience that I got to meet Claudia Black and work closely with her for a period of several years in the 2000 and teens. And in fact, she wrote a wonderful endorsement for Roots and Wings, which is something that it's an exquisite blessing. In, and so getting back to my experience, I think my mother did the best she could, and in part she was just trying to find a way to get me to be more okay and to help me somehow become less of an asshole, pardon my language. Because even though again I have this long history of living kind of a double life and taking care of business really well in some areas while acting out in others. And I did well in school. I was a varsity athlete, student council vice president, but also was a notorious pot dealer, and was rebellious and oppositional in other ways. And I think my mother was simply looking for potential solutions, and so came across this and thought, well, maybe this could be something that would be helpful. And as I mentioned, I had an open enough mind, or at least did want to provide an easy excuse. I mean, very, very basically, I always had an ambivalent relationship with my parents, and learning how to negotiate that has always been an incredible challenge. I mean, part of my experience is that I knew, from the time that I started my professional education, I knew I wasn't a sociopath because I always felt extremely guilty when when I acted in ways that were inappropriate, that created suffering for myself as well as those around me. And that's part of the deal with my family too. It was a progressive Jewish family in metropolitan New York, and guilt was weaponized. So, one of the things I've learned really well, and this has been reinforced in my 12-step program as well as in my professional education and experience, is that, the voices that our primary caregivers talk to us in, and the messages that they give us, the predominant, prevalent messages, become the voices in that we talk to ourselves in. They become our internal voices, and those messages become the messages that we tell ourselves. And in fact, my first sponsor put it in these terms, that the lies other people told us once about us once upon a time become the lies that we tell ourselves. And that's so much speaks to the heart of the wounding that so many people experience, those small T traumas. And that, one of the things that's become really apparent, and more and more research bears this out over the last 20, 30 years, is that whether or not people have experienced the so-called big T traumas, assaults, physical or sexual, natural disasters, acts of terrorism, and and so forth. Almost everyone has experienced a variety of small T traumas in their formative years, their early childhood experience. These small but significant tears in the fabric of connection, where those that we are explicitly dependent upon, physically and materially as well as emotionally, simply aren't there for us. Emotionally, if not also physically. And those tears in the fabric of connection uh, accumulate over time, and they they have great meaning in how we view ourselves as worthwhile, our sense of self worth, and self esteem, and so much of the healing that can benefit everyone. And this is obviously significantly true of people who are struggling with active addiction or have come through that. But it's true of the vast majority of people. It's simply part of being human, especially in U.S. and Western culture. And mindfulness has a really exquisite perspective on that experience. So that the natural, normal, automatic self-talk that's unconscious sends us the message, I'm not good enough. Whereas mindfulness adds the exquisitely enhanced perspective that, oh, I notice that I'm having the thought that I'm not good enough. It is a small difference in language perhaps, but a vast difference in perspective. And one of the things we know is that when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. And that certainly includes how we view ourselves, and coming to terms with who and how we are. Working to progressively learn and grow and heal, which is a lifelong process as far as I'm concerned, and is really the definition of recovery in the big picture, an ongoing process of learning, growth, and healing. But an essential aspect of that is coming to terms with learning to accept, observe, and be present with the parts of ourselves that we struggle with. Because everyone has them. No matter how successful or immaculate they may look from the outside, everyone has their stuff. Everyone struggles with certain stories that the continuous waterfall of thoughts and images that the human mind creates that drag them back into the past or propel them into the future, taking them away from the present moment, here and now, which is where recovery happens one day at a time. It happens one moment at a time. Life happens in this moment, right here, right now. And whenever we're somewhere else in the past or the future, based on the seductive, compelling stories our thoughts are telling us, we are unable to be skillful in this moment. We're somewhere else with other people, and that's where so much of the mental, emotional anguish and suffering comes in when we allow ourselves to get caught up in those stories because we think them, so we assume that they're true. We believe them, and really they're just stories. They're just neurochemically created, past conditioned to a fair extent bullshit.
Well, Dan, you talk about it like it's so easy, right? Like we just have to change our thoughts and we can change everything else. But the piece that's a little challenging. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were, they're starting a new relationship and they want to know if this is a good thing. And my suggestion was, look, you've talked about all of this trauma in the past, and you've talked about relationship problems in the past, and the idea that this person that you're engaging with doesn't like any of that stuff, and they're dedicated to leaving that all behind. The fact of the matter is, it's within their system. They've picked up on these cultural dynamics, right? The mirror neurons in our bodies pick up on those, that when we get stressed and when we are in situations, we go into automatic pilot, right? Our body and our mind shift in such a way that we're in automatic, and we will repeat those patterns no matter how much we hated them, no matter how much we're resolved to change them, unless we can be aware of them and be mindful, like you talked about. And so it's linked in so many deep levels, and the way the limbic brain and that protective brain, or that survival part of our brain, kicks in and links all of those pieces together, like you talked about. It's pretty complex, and it takes an awful lot of effort. But I do absolutely agree with you that meditation and mindfulness is the way to observe and recognize that these things you've done your whole life that seem normal because it's the only thing you knew, actually are just, like you said, it's just a story in our mind. It's just a reaction, and we get to choose when we can slow it down enough to be aware it's going on.
Exactly, Shelley. And there's nothing easy about it. It takes a tremendous amount of awareness as well as action to begin the process of changing these well-worn patterns. But one of the beauties is the existence of neuroplasticity, where the more we practice being consciously aware, when in the past we've been unconscious and in that form of automatic autopilot, the more we practice conscious awareness and various forms of mindfulness, the more our neuroanatomy and chemistry changes through repetitive experience. But it doesn't happen easily or quickly. It happens over time, certainly not overnight, and it requires the only way to get better at anything is to learn the techniques that work and to practice them with persistence and with consistency. Knowing that the best we can do is be perfectly imperfect. But that's why this is effectively the work of a lifetime. And so much of these patterns, this past conditioning, come from how we learn to, there are our defense mechanisms, are the modes of self-protection that we learned that helped us maintain mental and emotional integrity and to survive whatever our experiences were. But as we know, comes a time those protective mechanisms no longer serve an adaptive purpose. It's no longer about survival. Now they just interfere with our ability to live life in a more direct and full way, constraining our psychological flexibility and limiting our ability to tolerate distress, regulate our emotions in ways that promote overall, mental, emotional, and spiritual as well as physical well-being. And so much of a wonderful place to start for anyone who's interested, is to simply become aware of what we're thinking, because that provides an instant separation of sorts from our thoughts. Instead of being the actor in the movie, we're observing the movie at a little bit of a distance, and then we can make some conscious, informed choices as to how we want to respond versus unconscious, automatic reacting. But another wonderful skill is simply to tune in to the quality of our breathing, to become consciously aware of it, and to slow and deepen our breathing. Just even taking 3 or 4 slow, deep breaths on our inhale, and breathe out fully and completely on our exhale. Because one of the things that happens in the body when we're caught up in various states of anxiety, fear, and stress is that part of the body's preparation for flight, fight, or freeze, in which is what's happening when we're in that stress or threat response mode. Our breathing becomes fast and shallow, and that helps us prepare to run away, to fight, to protect ourselves, and so we can counteract that process by becoming consciously aware of our breathing and intentionally shifting the quality of our breathing. And just as an example of how challenging this stuff is, I've been meditating daily for 40 years, and I've been practicing these other techniques, these other skills for 15 or 20 years, including intentional breathing. And any given day, there are multiple times during the day where I catch myself. My thoughts are telling me some crazy stories which don't have anything to do with what's happening right here and right now. Let me bring my attention back to the present. Oh, what's my breathing like? Oh, consistent with the stories I'm caught up in, my breathing is out of balance. It's faster and shallower. Let me take a few moments and just focus on making it slower and deeper. And earlier on in my practice, I would be very self-critical, in part consistent with the messages that I received once upon a time. I'm not doing it right. I should be better at this by now. I should be more advanced, more skillful, and so forth. But one of the things I've learned is that it's simply part of the process, and it's part of the human condition. And so now it's no big deal. And so related to what I was talking about before, such an essential part of the overall healing process, and this has been reinforced in my personal recovery as well, is learning self-acceptance. When we can accept ourselves, the good, the bad, and the ugly, while making a good faith effort to improve in the ways that we can, but accept ourselves even with all of our challenges, all of our areas of difficulty, our relative weaknesses, that is an essential part of the path of healing at depth.
Well, I think it's vital. What you share is that without that acceptance, really, I don't know that much healing happens, because there's always that voice in the back of your head that says, it may be true for everybody else, but it's not for me. And so that acceptance is a really big piece of having self-love. I had somebody, we were doing a podcast here not too long ago, and somebody was talking about how their perception of a scripture in the Bible that said, do unto others as you do unto yourself, or be kind to your neighbor as like you would be kind to yourself, that scripture that became very different to them in the sense of it wasn't just to be kind to your neighbor and do good to others, but it was you've got to do it to yourself too. You've got to love yourself and be kind to yourself too. So that came up for me. I'm curious, Dan. I've got this burning question that I suspect other people are wondering too. Is that you've been doing meditation for 40 years, and you started it at age 16 on some level, and have been doing it. Found value in it, but it wasn't enough to stop you from using and self-medicating, but I imagine it played a role. Can you talk about what that looked like in your life as you practiced meditation and how it shifted as you became sober?
That's a great question, Shelley. And in fact, so my experience is an excellent example of how meditation won't get anyone clean and or sober. But once I made the commitment to find and keep recovery, meditation is integrated into the 11th step of the 12-step programs. We saw it through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God, with our higher power, as we understand that. So it was clear to me that my previous experience would be a wonderful resource that I could draw upon to enrich and deepen the quality of my recovery. And in fact, one of the things that I've experienced is that a great many people, and I've been blessed to know and consider my friends, hundreds of people in recovery from every state in the U.S., from different countries in the world, many of whom have 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 and more years of recovery. But because meditation, has this mystique, and it's so different for so many people that even many people with long-term recovery have had difficulty accessing it, making it part of their recovery, never mind their daily practice. So this was simply a significant advantage that I was gifted with. It's funny. It's like, there are many stories. This is actually, I think, in the introduction of Some Assembly Required. But there are so many wonderful stories about people who overcame their active addiction, went on to become addiction counselors, behavioral health professionals, and so forth. Well, like so much else in my life, I did things very ass backwards. And, up until the tail end of my active addiction, I had been a very successful behavioral health professional, including working in addiction treatment. And then I found recovery. Would have been simpler and more straightforward, easier in some respects, if I had gone the conventional route. But that wasn't in the cards for me.
I'm just thinking about you as this very successful behavioral health practitioner who's in the throes of addiction, teaching others to recover from addiction. Did that feel like a double bind for you a little bit?
Absolutely. When I allowed myself to consider it consciously, and I kept it at a distance an awful lot of the time. Intellectualization being my favorite defense mechanism personally. Deep down, part of me absolutely felt like a hypocrite, and that was always really challenging, which was why I didn't allow it conscious, even the thoughts, conscious expression much of the time. But my career bore the manifestations of significant degrees of success, promotions and excellent performance evaluations, including 360-degree performance evaluations, and partnerships with many significant people in the community in terms of the health, behavioral health, and governmental quarters of the communities where I lived in New York and Tucson prior to this happening. And I've been in Las Vegas for 12 years. But one of the beauties of recovery is that that's a struggle I no longer have, and do not have to worry about. It doesn't take up space in my thinking or weigh on my consciousness or my conscience, for that matter.
Yeah, which is heavy. That's heavy. So I'm wondering, and this is an interesting. You may not have the answer to this question, but you're teaching addiction recovery principles and skills and I can tell that there's a lot of avoidance of your own situation while you're using and in that space. But you're teaching all these skills. You're very familiar with them. You've got a pretty good handle on them. But in and of itself, that wasn't enough to recover from your own addiction and your own patterns. I'm curious, what was, and you've probably talked about this a little bit, but what made that shift for you? What do you feel like changed?
Well, ultimately, I got in trouble with the licensing board in the state of Arizona, where I was practicing at that time. And to her credit, my ex-wife had been telling me for many years, "You're an addict and you need to do something about it." And in part aided by my professional education, experience, and success, I had exquisite lines of rationalization and intellectualization. And one of the bottom lines, Shelley, is that also related to neuroplasticity, the neuronal connections related to using, the need for reward and relief was so deeply ingrained in my neuroanatomy, as well as my life experience, that the idea of not doing that, the idea of not using on a daily basis, even if it was always after work at that time, was really inconceivable to me. And it was terrifying also. And we know that the familiarity is always much more comfortable than the unknown. And that's one of the dynamics that keeps people stuck in a place of that is often deeply unhealthy and sometimes quite literally dangerous. It's one of the reasons why people stay mired in active addiction for as long as they do. It's what keeps people in violent, absolutely dangerous relationships. When people are telling them, "You have to get out. You're going to get more seriously injured. You're going to get killed." And even with the various facets of denial and minimization, on some level, deep down, the individual has some sense of that. But the uncertainty of the unknown is more scary than the certainty of the horror that they know, with everything that goes along with it. And that's one of the reasons why it's so profoundly difficult to make significant life and lifestyle changes like that.
Well, and I love the way you described that, and hopefully those questions did not come across as any kind of criticism, but more lending to the power of addiction and just how profound and how influential it is. And you're right. Those reward centers and the body saying, yeah, no, we're going to protect this at all costs because we need this and we need this self-medication and then the rationalizations that I'm successful and it's not involved, it's not compromising my relationships and my work enough, right? And the pain's not enough, but addiction is powerful.
Right.
And you're exactly right. So I didn't ever want that to come across as criticism, but just addiction is so powerful. I have another question for you, Dan, that I'm curious about. You said that you come from a Jewish background. And so I don't know what kind of, length or what kind of practices that you had in your home on a religious basis, but I'm curious how that has influenced you. There's a lot of people that talk about little t traumas, like you mentioned, in some of those shaming, controlling environments, right, that sometimes religion can bring. But also, does it play a role now, and what does that look like now?
That's a good question, Shelley, and no worries on your previous question. By the way, we were not deeply religious, and that was an area that I rebelled against. Really, as from the time that I became any sort of religious observance was kind of foisted on me. And in fact, I was, so we were more, although, we were affiliated with the synagogue and went on Sundays when I was a kid. It was never something that was going to permeate very, very much for me. And in fact, as a result of acting out, primarily being a class clown and so forth, and being oppositional, I successfully was booted from Hebrew school when I was in 6th grade. And so I was bar mitzvahed having memorized cassette tapes that were made for me of the Hebrew portions so well that I could recall significant parts of them 6 years later. But my bar mitzvah was also my retirement from any involvement in organized religion. And I consider myself a deeply spiritual but not at all religious person. And I identify with Judaism culturally rather than religiously. In my first marriage and now in my second, and with our kids from my first marriage, my wives have been non-Jewish. So we've celebrated, as an adult, I've celebrated the big Jewish as well as the Christian holidays. We did Christmas and Hanukkah. We do Passover and Easter.
Fascinating. You talked about this idea that spirituality has become a really big piece separate from religion, which I like that distinction. And I'm going to just note one of the chapters in your book that's called "If You Meet the Buddha, Say Hello." Talk a little bit about maybe what's behind that, and then how spirituality has played a role for you.
Well, that was such a remarkable experience. As that passage details, I recently graduated from my undergraduate work at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and a friend and I were preparing for a backpacking trip in the Desolation Wilderness in Lake Tahoe, and we stopped at a Safeway at South Lake Tahoe to put together some supplies, including an excellent value-based Cabernet more than one bottle to go with the steak that we were purchasing, and our dessert, which was Northern California sensimilla. And so well, I get online, and even I have to tell you, Shelley, even after 40 years of daily meditation, my patience is still pretty limited as a personal attribute. That will be a work in progress over the course of the rest of my life, I'm certain. So, like a lot of people, waiting in line at the grocery store to check out is no fun, and we just want to get through it as quickly as absolutely possible. And the line next to me, I look over, and and there's this cashier, and he's short, he's he's impressively overweight, he's bald, he's got these really thick Coke bottle type black horn rimmed glasses on, and he is having the greatest time. He engages everyone that he's checking out in this wonderful, warm, sort of emotional bear hug of a greeting, and he's got this incredible twinkle in his eye. And I was drawn to it, kind of like a moth to a flame. To my amazement, I got out of the line I was in and got on a longer line. First time and only time I've ever done that in my whole life, because whatever this phenomenon was, I wanted to experience it in a more direct and up close way. And this person, he was so he was so in tune with 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 the universe. It seemed to me it was almost like he was floating a few inches above the ground, even though obviously gravity was a significant influence on him, given his physicality. But I get up to him, and he greets me in this same warm, wonderful. It's great to see you, my old friend sort of way that he greeted everyone else, and I looked at him and I just said, it's great to see someone who really seems to know how to enjoy life, and he looked at me, he leaned towards me, lowered his voice a little bit, and said, and it doesn't cost anything extra. And I was like, holy shit. I mean, it was so brilliant and so wise and profound. It was as if he really was some sort of incarnation of something resembling the Buddha, or this highly evolved, incredibly present-centered being. Uh, and as I wrote, it was in that moment, it was kind of like I knew everything I'd ever need to know, and like always happens, I forgot it soon thereafter. And so, I mean, we can most most of us know a great deal. We have a tremendous amount of information, knowledge, wisdom, and resources that we have access to internally and otherwise. Part of the human condition and part of the challenges related to active addiction, but all forms of human challenge, is that we forget what we know, and we forget it easily and regularly. And so a big part of being conscious and being skillful, whatever our challenges may be, is remembering what we know so that we can apply it when we need to in the unfolding moments of our lives. And that's how we can become much more aware and much more skillful.
Dan, I love that story. I love that story. And isn't it interesting how we can shift and things can shift for us in just these simple moments? And often it has to do with connection with another person. Super powerful. We could probably talk all day. I would highly recommend that our listeners read Some Assembly Required and Roots to Wins, those books that you have written, because I think there's a ton of wisdom in there. We've only barely scratched anything there. Um, but I love what you bring to the table. I love hearing your journey, and I appreciate you sharing. I'm wondering if people that are listening want to connect with you and talk more. What's a good way for them to connect?
They can reach out to me via my website, which is Dan at mindful healing for the number, which is the number for life.com. So mindful healing, the number for life.com.
Excellent. I suspect there's people that are going to want to pick your brain and utilize some of your experience as well as your knowledge and wisdom around those meditation and mindfulness and your journey. So I love that you're willing to share that with us today, and I just appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Oh, the other access point for listeners would be my Psychology Today blog, which is also titled "Some Assembly Required," and there's a mechanism through which people can reach out to me via inquiries in connection with the blog.
And I love that you write for Psychology Today. That's a pretty well-known platform and says a lot about you. So thanks for sharing that as well. This has been a pleasure, and I have to say I love the name of your book, Some Assembly Required. That really rings true to me in so many ways when we're talking about healing and the human experience and our approach to that. So I, again, just really appreciate your comments today.
Thank you so much, Shelley. It's been a pleasure meeting with you and being with you. And if at any point it would be helpful for us to continue this discussion, by all means, I would look forward to it.
That would be fantastic. I would love that.